Right, welcome back everybody. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break and you've enjoyed the session so far this morning. We're on to the final furlong now, but we've got two cracking sessions to round it off, and then you've just got to listen to me for 5 minutes or so before you can get your flights home. Up on the stage with me I have Alistair Darling, former Chancellor of the Exchequer and former Edinburgh MP. And of course, well, Alistair actually reminded me earlier on, he wrote a book called Back from the Brink, which was about the banking crisis in 2008 and how he and the team around him were able to capitalise some of the banks and stop some of those banking runs that we were all very concerned about. And it's those sorts of moments that I referred to when I did my opening remarks on Wednesday, when I described that as day zero of the current political and economic situation that we're in. So Alistair's going to give us his take on where we are. He's going to be talking for about 15 minutes, so it's going to be quite a short presentation. So please do start thinking questions, otherwise we're going to have to get on to our summer holidays. So do start thinking about questions. You can do it in the old-fashioned way with your hand in the air, but of course also don't forget to submit them through the app. If you hear anything you're particularly interested in, you think the rest of the world should know about it, don't forget you can tweet using the hashtag PLSInvest19. So, Alistair, welcome. Thank you very much for coming along. Can you tell us what you've got to say?
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard, for your kind introduction and your plug for my book, which is still available from all good booksellers, should you wish to read about it. Thank you for asking me to speak to you this morning. It was a very easy invitation to accept, since I live only 10 minutes away from here. And a home match is infinitely preferable to an away one. But for those of you who don't live in Edinburgh, I know that you've been coming here for some years now, but I hope you've enjoyed being here. As we always say in Scotland, you should have been here last week because it was really hot. And just like it normally is in this part of the world, it's just unfortunate this week's been a wee bit dreich, as we say, in Edinburgh. Now, I want to talk about what's happening today, because that's obviously what is concerning you. And I've also been asked to maybe think about what lessons you might draw from what happened 10 years ago. And what I want to do just now is to set the scene and leave plenty of time for questions and answers. A word of warning, first of all. I appreciate that in an audience of this size, you will not all have the same views, and in particular on the subject of Brexit, there will be one or two people in here who may take a different view to the view that I take. All I can say to you, if that's your view, is you should have checked carefully to see what I thought in the first place, and if you really didn't like it, you could have spent more time looking around the lovely sights in Edinburgh and spare yourself having to listen to my views. So I do apologise for that. Your title of your conference is Investing on the Brink, and in many ways that is where we are at the moment. Because if you think about it, we are 21 days, that's it, 21 days, from the possibility of leaving Europe without any deal and walking in effect blindfolded into a future that is completely unknowable, one for which we have not planned, and indeed we can't plan for it. We're that close to one of the biggest decisions that this country has taken since the end of the Second World War. And even if we do get a deal, if Mrs. May's deal goes through, and I'll come back to that later, all that is an exit deal. What it does is it commits us to a further period of 2 years where we have to decide on our future relationship with the rest of Europe. And as we haven't been able to decide that in the last 2.5 years, it does beg the question, what's going to happen in the next 2 that is going to make it any different or any better? And it is, the situation we face today is in its own way as serious as it was 10 years ago. I often reflect that actually no matter how bad it was 10 years ago, I could see how to fix that problem. Today, I don't actually see how we're going to fix it anytime soon. But the financial crisis of 2008 was the result of people taking on huge risks they didn't understand and that they couldn't control. And as the sheer scale of the problem became clear, confidence vanished, and the banking system came within hours of collapse. The circumstances today are different because the risks are political, they are very visible, and actually they are mainly avoidable if we choose to do that. Brexit, in my view, whatever transpires, is going to be a second-best solution for us, and its effects are going to be felt for years. And of course, if you look at the background against which we're taking these decisions, the spectre of trade wars, the growth of a narrower, nationalistic and protectionist worldview should worry all of us. And of course, whereas international cooperation was absolutely key to avoiding a complete meltdown 10 years ago, today you cannot rely on that. And indeed, we're still living with the economic and the political consequences of what happened then. Now, 2008 was certainly a scary moment. I'll always remember the phone call I took at the beginning of October of 2008. This is about 3 weeks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and the night after I'd met the CEOs and chairmen of the biggest banks in this country, when I outlined to them what the government was going to do to make sure the banking system was secure. And I said to them when they left the meeting, whatever you do, do not discuss what we've been discussing tonight, because people will panic if they think the British government is about to bail out the banks. It may surprise you to know that precisely 30 minutes later, we got the first call from the BBC and then from the FT with a remarkably accurate account of what had happened. And of course, the next morning, RBS shares tanked. And the scary call was this. I was in Luxembourg attending a meeting of finance ministers, something, of course, my successors won't have to do. But I was called out of the meeting and I had to speak to the then chairman of RBS, who said to me, we're hemorrhaging funds, billions of pounds. He said, what are you going to do about it? Which I thought was quite interesting, that this was the biggest bank in the world, and they were asking me what I was going to do about it. And I said, look, we've got a plan, we're almost ready to go. How long can you last? And what he said was what shook me to the core. He said, maybe 2 or 3 hours. You think about it, if RBS had gone down, it would have taken the rest of the banks down with it, because people would have panicked, not just here, but elsewhere. Now, we had a plan, and we did more than people expected, and we did it more quickly than anyone was expecting it, and that's why it worked, that and the international cooperation we had. And if you compare that with what's happening with Greece over the last 10 years, you'll see that if you do get a crisis like that, you need to act immediately, and you need to do more than people expect if you're going to stop it. Now, today, banks are far better capitalized, they're more conscious about the need for liquidity. You can't be complacent, but the system is stronger. But of course, it is only as strong as its weakest link. What are the lessons you learn from that, apart from the need to take decisive action? Well, one is you need to understand risk, and too many people then didn't. You know, I remember one of these meetings I had in the Treasury with one particular bank CEO and his chairman, and he came up to me at the end of the meeting and said, look, I want to reassure you about something. And I said, what's that? And he said, look, we met last night in our board, and we've decided that from now on, we'll only take on risks that we understand. That did not cheer me up one bit, because it confirmed what I thought. The other lesson, which is relevant today, is the international cooperation. I'll give you 3 examples of why it worked in 2008. Firstly, when RBS, the biggest bank in the world, the size of the UK's GDP went down, we had to keep it going not just through the UK trading day, but through the American trading day as well. And the Bank of England spoke to the US Fed and said, do whatever it takes to keep that bank going. And they didn't ask at any point, who's paying for this? Or, you know, what guarantees can you offer? They just did it. Now, I wonder whether that would happen today. I don't think it would. And equally, when we did this banking package, I was able to meet my counterparts at the IMF annual meetings a few days later from America, from the Eurozone, and to make sure we all agreed that we all had to be doing the same thing. And again, later that year, under the chairmanship of President Bush, and the last few things he did before he left the White House, all the countries, big countries in the world, agreed to do the same thing to keep our economies going. And that international cooperation is important, because if you look at today's problems, whether it's trade, whether it's climate change, the issues of data protection, cyber attacks, financial stability, none of that is going to be possible unless you get international cooperation, which at the moment is under something of a strain. That cooperation, too, was vital in the coordinated stimulus that all of us put into our economies, from Republican America to Communist China. We all did the same thing to stop the risk of recession becoming depression. And it worked. Our economy actually started to grow in 2009. I thought I'd mention that just in case you forgot that, but it was actually growing from 2009. That's certainly slowed down since that time. I think the tragedy was that stimulus was taken off too soon, and an over-reliance was put on monetary policy and quantitative easing, for which it was never designed, and not to operate in a long term like that. And as I said, the economic consequences we know about. We stopped catastrophe, if you like. The economies throughout the world generally grew, but that growth has been sporadic. And of course, because it was necessary to repair countries' finances, we had, in the years that followed that, what is commonly known as austerity. And one of its side effects is that people's standard of living fell, people's expectations were lowered, people began to think there wasn't much hope. And that had its political consequences, which we've seen all over the world. And it's Trump in America, Brexit here, the growth of the far right in parts of Europe, and we shall see what happens later this year in the elections, and the growth of nationalism. And in many ways, Brexit to me has been a proxy for that generalized discontent, where people have become uncertain and untrusting of institutions and of politics and politicians. And I just say this about undermining institutions. When people do things wrong, they should be called out. But in an industry like yours, if people start losing trust in the institutions where they place their savings and in the expectation that they will have a pension or other benefits when they retire many, many years hence, then that's bad for all of us as well as individuals concerned. Trust has to be earned, it has to be deserved. But when I look around the world and see how willy-nilly people are trashing institutions, I do worry about it. That takes me on to the subject of Brexit. Though in some ways the result we had, 48-52, was the worst possible result because it's so close. The country is frankly split down the middle. What I think should have happened back in 2016 is we should have had a grown-up conversation at home and with the European Union. At home, saying to people, look, there's going to have to be some compromise here. And indeed, especially when the Leave side didn't actually, it appears, have a plan that we could adopt if we were going to leave. There was bound to be a lot of discussion about where we should go. And equally with the rest of the European Union, there's lots of voices within the European Union who would like to do things differently. We've managed to unite them at the moment in the discussions against us. But if you listen to what President Macron was saying last week, at least there's a sign there that people are willing to discuss things like freedom of movement and so on. That didn't happen, and instead we rather painted ourselves into a corner. So where do we stand with 21 days or so to go? Unfortunately, all these options, as I said, are second best. The government's own figures show that whatever you do, our growth is going to be slower than otherwise. I think no deal is unlikely, quite simply because I don't think there are enough, frankly, mad people to vote for it, because I think it would be reckless in the extreme. To go on to WTO tariffs, and we don't even know what our tariffs might be because there's still discussions about it, in 3 weeks' time would be absolute madness. And if we had no customs union, it's not just Northern Ireland, the border there that you'd worry about, but also what it does to supply chains and so on. And this is a risk, as I said earlier, there's some risks that you can avoid, and this is one that I hope we will avoid. The second option, Mrs. May's deal, well, I don't know. I've always thought that the European Union will do a last-minute concession because that's what they always do. Certainly my experience of 13 years as minister, people do come up with compromises. Whether it's enough to get people over the line, I simply don't know. What I would say about that deal is I don't think it's a good one because it locks you into negotiations which you can't get out of unless we reach an agreement that's satisfactory to the other side. But it's infinitely better than no deal. And we'll wait and see if that happens. If that fails, then you're left with maybe an extension to Article 50. Although it simply, it puts off the day when we decide as a nation, what do we actually want? My view is it is probably the best of the three options because at some stage we're going to we need some degree of stability over the next couple of years, but we do need to decide what this country wants. At the moment, if you go into negotiations and you don't know what you want, and the whole world can see that you don't know what you want, you're not going to achieve anything at all. What will actually happen? Well, that's difficult to forecast, and indeed, the House of Commons, because it can make its own rules and how it votes and so on, you never know what might turn up. I think a no deal is unlikely. I think it is possible that Mrs. May get her deal. She's simply running down the clock at the moment. She may peel off some of the softer Brexiteers who may think this is better than putting the whole thing off, and she may attract maybe 20 plus Labour MPs who live in predominantly Leave constituencies. I just simply don't know. There may be other options. I think that is unlikely just at the moment. But whatever happens, I'm afraid you're going to be in for a period of some uncertainty. And one of the big problems we face in this country, and obviously you can accuse me of being a former politician, and I would say this, wouldn't you? But just at the moment, one of the things that depresses me is that our politics is being pulled by extremes on either side. The centre ground at the moment has absolutely no voice. It's always been my view that if you want to govern this country, you've got to get the centre ground on your side. Otherwise, you simply can't do it. And at the present time, we need a bit of leadership, because if we don't sort this out, then we're in for a lot of uncertainty. And it will cost us. Our GDP was hit badly from the crisis 10 years ago. Our economy should have been growing now at a steady state, but it's not. It's bumping along again. But I'm afraid that's where we are. If it carries on like this, yes, of course we can cope, because we always have done. It just seems to me that we don't need to be in this position. There's a self-inflicted wound, and it's one for which I think our children will think very badly of us if we don't sort it out. So on that happy note, I'd now be interested to hear what you've got to say, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions about anything I've said, or being an ex-politician, anything I didn't say. Thank you very much.
So we were talking earlier on about people submitting questions through the app, and you asked me, do people really do that? I had 2 questions before you got to the lectern.
All right.
So we've got a huge period of time that we can cover in conversation, but I'd like to just start with that beginning point, that year zero back in 2008. With the benefit of hindsight, that was a really critical time. You talked about the banking meltdown. We can probably all imagine what that would have looked like. Would you have done anything differently?
No.
Okay.
All I would say is that when you ask what happened 10 years ago, the objective was to stop the banking system from collapsing, and it worked. And to tell you the truth, when we worked at that, putting the plan together over that night following my call with RBS, we had no means of knowing the next morning whether it would work. I remember going on the Today programme, as you do, at 7 o'clock when it had all been announced. And, I had to sound very calm and very confident, because otherwise people pick up your jitteriness, especially on a radio when they're listening to you. But it wasn't until later in that day, when we could see things were stabilising, that we saw that it did work. Now, if you go on further, could we have done things, more in relation to the economy? I said to you, our economy did start to grow at the back end of 2009. I think the mistake was that collectively, people assumed by the end of 2010 that it was fixed, whereas it most certainly was not. There's lots of things, if you look back, like Northern Rock, for example. If we'd had the powers to get hold of Northern Rock over a weekend and basically recapitalise and sort it, you wouldn't have had those queues going on and on and on. I think it worked. I think actually the test for all of us to make sure is we never ever have to do that again.
Okay. And just as an extension, and there's a slight element of self-interest in this now, my daughter's just been offered a job by RBS to take up when she graduates in September. Was RBS a success story, do you think?
Well, was it a success story? Well,
or is it?
I think now it is. It's been turned around. Ross McEwen, who's the CEO at the moment, has done a very good job. And basically, what he's constructing is, a traditional high street bank that has investment facilities and so on. But the problem with RBS beforehand is it had grown from being a high street bank into something much, much bigger. And when they took over NatWest and they took over all the other things, they just grew and grew and grew. And then, of course, when they went after ABN AMRO, the Dutch bank, they took on something that they didn't understand. It was like going to a car boot sale and buying a box of stuff, and the stuff on top looked all right. And then you took that off, and underneath was, are terrible things. I think in terms, you look at the bank rescue, I keep saying this to people, all the money that we had to spend, we got back, the liquidity schemes and the guarantees and all that. The one thing that I think is unlikely we're going to see our money back on is on RBS shares for some considerable time yet. It was so badly damaged. But as a bank now, it's fine. But in this city of all cities where it's based, you come in from the airport, you can see, It's, if you want to see hubris, that is it. It's head office there with a cobbled high street inside it and all the rest of it. In fact, for many years, I used to come in from the airport and I used to look at that and think, I own that. I think the government's planning to sell it off and put that right.
Okay. So has anybody in the room got a question, or I can carry on working through these questions and the questions I've got? Okay, so no obvious volunteers straight away. So let's bring it a bit more up to date, where we are now. Imagine you were still Chancellor. You'd have been the longest serving Chancellor by now, but maybe you're on your second stint of it. Philip Hammond, let's put aside the political debate around whether he's going to go for support the deal or remain or hard Brexit or whatever. But just as the Chancellor, as the technician who is the Chancellor, what would you be doing now?
Well, it's very difficult to be planning for something because you don't know what you're planning for.
Exactly.
If contrary to what I think, Parliament votes for a no deal, then what I think he's going to have to do is, he will have to do some sort of economic stimulus of the sort that I described 10 years ago. Because I think it's not the immediate effect. It's as people begin to realise, look, they don't have a trading deal with anybody in the world. They don't know what tariffs they're going to have. The risk of getting that uncertainty and then maybe something will happen that people begin to panic is such that the government will have to be ready to respond to that. The Bank of England equally will no doubt have to take action. I think, as I said to you, I just hope it's unlikely. I think, if Mrs May's deal goes through, and Philip Hammond supports that because it gives a transitional arrangement, which he's always argued for, then you've got longer time to think about things. The big question for us as a country, though, is what's the long-term relationship going to be, not just with Europe. And, this matters. I mean, the warning signs are there now. If you look at the car industry, look at the aviation industry, the world has moved on where everybody made their own things and bought and sold things. The supply lines are so interlinked. The financial services industry is an example of that. It's very difficult to plan against something where you simply don't know things, let alone, are we going to have a new trade deal with America? Well, things will no doubt move on from chlorinated chickens to wider issues than that, but we simply don't know. And when you consider the going rate to fix a trade deal is 7 years, that's a hell of a long time. So it's very difficult for anyone in the Treasury at the moment to make long-term plans. And one of the things I didn't mention, but which is important for your industry, is that the government at the moment, understandably, is doing nothing else but thinking about Brexit. And it means other big issues like long-term saving. How do you get people to save and so on? Structural problems in the workforce and so on. They just simply do not have the capacity to be thinking about those things at the moment. In my experience, I've known a number of prime ministers. Most prime ministers, if they're lucky, can think about one big thing and two other things at once. You can't, and the rest of it just falls by the wayside. And Brexit is so big, it's the only thing that's being talked about at the moment.
In many respects, actually, that's to our advantage. We've had long periods of time where we've had change after change after change after change. It's quite nice to have a pensions minister who's not introducing new legislation all the time, a Treasury that is focused elsewhere and not trying to change our tax reliefs. We haven't had any tax relief changes for a while. But that's a nice segue into the next question. So the Treasury will be thinking about and planning about the worst possible contingencies, and we're going to have a reduction in GDP. The Treasury is going to need money from somewhere. How could you just take us through your feeling? How does it work inside the Treasury? So pension tax reliefs, large amount of money in fact, it's not really tax relief, it's tax deferral. But pension tax relief, large chunk of money, over £30 billion. When it comes to the crunch, how easy do you think is it for them to attack that, which is a short-term gain, but potentially long-term expense?
Well, I think in relation to pensions, if you look at what's happened, and I did some of it in 2009-10, George Osborne did a lot of it, and Tory chancellors have a lot more latitude in these things than other people do. I think that what you do have to be very careful about is in your quest for short-term revenues that you don't store up a whole bunch of problems, further down the line. And the Treasury as an institution does tend to think long-term. Now, I'm not saying every chancellor does, but the Treasury as an institution does think about that. I think, but if things were really bad, you can't get the money you would need by simply going around looking at reliefs and doing the rest of it. What generates revenues for the Treasury is economic activity. That's where your income taxes come in. That's where your VAT receipts come in, and so on. The only way you can, if you want to spend money and you need to spend it immediately, the only way you can do it, frankly, in the short term, is to borrow more. Now, we could actually do that if we needed to at the moment, although our debt levels are pretty high, though they're not as high as they were at the end of the Second World War, if you want to put things in perspective. But I think the Treasury, would be not looking at sort of short-term fixed things. Right. It'd be more looking at about some sort of stimulus to try and get things moving. But I keep coming back to this point. You can have as many state-sponsored things as you want. If you don't have a macroeconomic environment where people will invest and take decisions, then you're not going to get the revenues, which is why I'm afraid there's no getting away from this. At some stage, we collectively in the UK are going to have to work out what relationship we want with the rest of the world.
So, I think that's a really interesting point, but we are... It's all very well to say that we're at this brink point and nobody knows quite what's going to happen next, but the reality is we are going to live through this. We have got to steer a course through it. Somebody has got to make decisions.
Yeah, and I made the distinction, when I started speaking. The problem in 2008 was an acute problem which actually was fixable. This is a more chronic problem, if you like. And as I said towards the end of my remarks, no matter what happens, we'll have to get on with it. My only question is, why the hell did we get ourselves into this mess in the first place? Because it wasn't someone didn't send something down from Mars and struck us, and it's not like there was a war or something like that. But our political system at the moment, it does not seem capable of putting up choices. And at the end of the day, we are going to have to make a choice. Are we going to stay in the customs union? Are we going to be in the single market? Does it matter to us that we don't have any say in these things? If we really think we can do things from outside, what's the relationship going to be? What's our tariff regime going to be? Because we trade so much, we exist on trade. We're not, like America or China, which a lot of it's internally generated, and there's no getting away from that, I'm afraid. And despite what some people say, there is no easy answer to it.
No, there's no. And if we try to do a root cause analysis, the economic crisis, people not understanding their financial risks, led to a huge amount of government debt, which led to austerity, which led to a generation of people not doing as well as their previous parents, which has led to mistrust of institutions and politicians, which has led to polarisation of politics. We're actually in a really tricky position.
Well, it's an interesting point you're making about the younger generation, who they are poorer, relatively speaking, than their parents' generation. And they are, in many cases, they're disillusioned with institutions, though predominantly they voted heavily to remain, where it's the older generation who, relatively speaking, are better off, who voted, in quite large numbers to leave. So it's a mix. But I think, in many ways, I see Brexit as a proxy for a whole lot of people's discontent about different things, and it all got channeled, into this one thing. Which is why I think it's going to take some time to work this out. And also, I'm not sure, I'm not sure how much opinion has moved on. An awful lot for a lot of people, this is a very heavily remaining city. And, I think the constituency that I represented until 2015 is one of the highest Remain votes anywhere. But it's amazing when you talk to people and you say, what do you think? They just say, I'm fed up with it. I just want rid of it all. I just want you to get on with it. That disengagement worries me. But unless today's politicians get hold of this, and unless they try and get some sort of order in it, you're storing up problems for the future. Because if you can't sort it out, people will start listening to people that normally you wouldn't give the time of day for.
Okay, so quite a high-risk opportunity. There's two questions at the front here.
Well, these are the two that occurred to you before I got to the microphone.
If you can tell us who you are before
Thank you. Stephen Glover from DG Publishing. I'm very curious to know, how much damage do you consider that such a sustained period of ultra-low interest rates has done to savings, and can it be repaired in order to meet the pensions promise for the next generation?
Well, I think, I mentioned earlier that when we introduced quantitative easing, which obviously was a good idea because I was there when it was introduced. It was meant to be a short-term remedy. It was part of shock therapy to get the economy growing. If you'd said to me 10 years ago, would you expect it still to be going now? Obviously, be wound down, but it's only relatively recently it was stopped in the UK, and of course the ECB yesterday has announced another extension or a variant thereof. So I think it was necessary at the time, and there's quite a lot of evidence that it helped get the economy to grow. I think what you're getting at is a bigger question. That is, one of the things that people don't understand, and I don't have an answer to it, is you would expect by now the economy growing, wage levels going up, inflation would start going up, so interest rates would going up, and that's not happening. If anything, at the moment, the expectation is that interest rates will stay steady, if not come down. And I again, this has been quite a long cycle, and people have always assumed that things bounce back because that's largely what they've done over the last 100 years or so. I think this period is likely to continue unless people can see some sort of political settlement. Now, whatever the political settlement is, if they can see it, they can adjust to it, and they can live with it, and people will start doing things again and buying and selling and all the rest of it. And at that time, you might see an adjustment in terms of inflationary pressure and so on. Richard and I were talking just before we started this. When I was growing up in the 70s, the big concern was wage inflation. Every night in the news, how do you keep wages down? The opposite's the case now. How on earth do you get wages up? Because we could do with a bit of inflation in the system, but I don't think it's going to come until you get that political settlement.
Jamie.
It's Jamie Jenkins, Standard Life. It was a variation of that question, actually. So thinking about this long period of low interest rates, which bad for savers, but good for people with credit and mortgages. I'm just wondering, in your view, over the last 10 years, are we kind of building a position where people are so mortgaged up, credit carded up, if you like, and have very little in the way of savings, where it's going to make it very hard to put interest rates up and grow the economy in a way that we might have done previously?
Well, I would answer that in two parts. Firstly, I think it is going to be very hard. 10 years is a long, long time, and everybody knows that interest rates are going to go up, except they don't think they will. And it's when you get the letter through the post or email, saying that your mortgages have been X for many years, but the interest rates are going up, it's now going up. And okay, 0.25% you can deal with, then another 0.25% maybe a year later you can deal with. But if interest rates suddenly were going up, steeper than that, it will cause people problems. Credit card debt is still very, very high. And indeed, understandably, many people are compensating for the lack of wages by borrowing. And if you can do it very easily and very cheaply, then why not? And of course, many people have no option. People who are making ends meet, but if anything happens, like a breakdown of household goods, something like that, they've no option but to borrow for that. So yes, I think it will be a problem. And equally, on the wider world front, if you like, there's many countries, of course, have been living in this view, and if interest rates start going up, you'll see effects there. Of course, a lot of it depends on how quickly interest rates do go up. Frankly, if they go up 0.25%, once a year, people, can adjust to that. But if something happened that suddenly interest rates would have to go up, I'm not so sure about that. But if both of you, in many ways, were asking, when will things go back to normal? Now, there's always an assumption that you do go back to normal. I remember the first day I was in the Treasury, and when I went back there in 2007, I was speaking to the Treasury's brightest economists who said the trend rate of growth in this country is 2.5%. And I said, how do you know that? They said, because that's what it's been for the last 100 years. And I said, well, how do we know it's going to be like that for the next 100 years? And they said, well, we do. And that was about 6 months before Northern Rock got into deep trouble.
So we can both see from the time that we're rapidly running through our time, but I wanted to quickly explore three other areas, recurring themes on here, and then one area I wanted to ask you about. First of all, a few people have said, could you comment on UK productivity? What's your fix for this?
Well, my answer is, it's not just a politician's answer. I think there's very few people can understand what the problem is we're trying to fix and how you measure productivity. You know, it was easy when you had a factory that made cars and you could divide the number of cars by the number of people who work there. How do you measure the productivity of somebody sitting in a train with a laptop, half watching a film and half doing useful work about investment strategies or whatever? Yeah, I can see that. You know, it's a difficult one to measure, and equally, you know, if you look at in France, where the productivity is higher, you know, the working week is generally, you know, slower and so on. I think, you know, I don't have an immediate answer for this, but I do, you know, it clearly is a problem for us. But I'm not. It's very difficult to solve a problem if you don't actually know what exactly it is. Okay. And that's where we are, I think.
Okay. So then the next question, which again is a recurring theme on here, is a bit more of a local issue, but I'm going to expand it out a little bit geographically. Brexit, the impact on the union, is the union going to survive this? And then as a sort of an associated question, what's your best get on what's going to happen to unionising or merging Northern Ireland into Ireland?
Right. On the second one, I think, you know, left to its own devices, if you've got another 100 years of peace and the rest of it, you know, you never know, because, you know, clearly if you look at the Sinn Féin vote was steadily increasing, the less tension there is, the more easy it is for people to get on with each other. But if you look at Northern Ireland today, the idea that they would come together and there wouldn't be, you know, difficulty, I think is, you know, you'd be very optimistic. So I mean, it's one of these things that obviously I'm not from Ireland, and, you know, if you're that detached, there are always risks in it. But I would think that's something that, you know, I think the best thing we can do is just make sure that what happens since the Good Friday Agreement continues. If you look at Scotland, as you know, there was a referendum here in 2014, and I've just observed in the passing, it is possible to win a referendum, but you do actually have to try. You know, I think the mistake in 2016 is that some people thought they could breeze their way through it and it would all be fine. If you look at the polls, they have not changed in the 5 years since the Scottish referendum. They're roughly 45-55. They haven't changed. If you look at the desire for another referendum in Scotland, the desire for it is very low. And indeed, in 2017, in the general election here in Scotland, it was very much a referendum on having a second referendum, and the Nationalists lost a lot of MPs, and they lost a substantial amount of vote. And I think if you talk to people here, they are sort of referendumed out. You know, and if you've been here for the last 5 years, the divisions, you know, the sometimes bitterness, rancor, it's here still. And people, you know, it hurt, and you know, people just don't want to go back to it. That's something you can never be complacent about. You know, English nationalism doesn't like Scottish nationalism, and you know, there's a lot of English nationalists who are calling the shots on the present government at the moment. Okay. So at the moment, I think that the will of people in Scotland at the moment is they'll stay in the UK, but like all these things, it's something you have to keep relationships, you have to work at them, which is all the more reason, to my mind, that, you know, Brexit affects us as much as it affects the rest of the United Kingdom. We need to sort this out.
So all of the English in here, make friends with a Scot before you go home. Work on that relationship.
One of the big things in the Scottish referendum was the fact that the majority of people in England, you know, all the polls, everything else showed that people wanted to stay together. But the more you polarize things, you know, whether it's right or left or, you know, nationalism against, you know, other things, the more you polarize things, the more, you know, you put stresses and strains where we don't need them, and we're all the loser as a result of that.
So we've both talked about the brink, theme of the conference, your book, and the brink is a point where you can go up or you can go down. I'm hopefully optimistic that we can go up. So let's end this session on a positive thing. You're involved with the Standard Life Research Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some of the good things that's planning to do?
Well, Standard Life set up this foundation, which is independent of Standard Life, so we can do our own thing. Basically, what we're looking at is financial well-being, financial resilience, and in particular, the thing that we're interested in is if you take the situation we've got today with an aging population, which of course will have its own savings, but which is dependent to a large extent on the state, either through the state pension or social care and the rest of it. And that clearly comes at a cost. It is being supported by a rising generation, the millennial generation, who are going to have to put their hands in their pockets to pay taxes for all this, and who by and large are earning less than their parents were. They've got student debt, they've got increased housing costs and so on. So they've got less disposable income, or less income that is potentially taxable. This is a long-term structural problem for not just us, but other countries as well. So it's that sort of long-term intergenerational divide we're looking at, as well as, today's problems. There are a lot of people who, as I was saying earlier, who can get by, but the minute something happens, they lose a job or there's some, financial, blow or burden to the system, people can't. So that's what it's looking at. And it's obviously in terms of what most of you do, which is about planning for their old age, and the generation that you're going to be engaging with now. There's a different generation to the baby boom generation, where there was an awful lot more certainty. I know in this day and age you can't be as certain as maybe you could there, but there's always uncertainty. Just to pick up on your final point, as I said, yes, we can get through it. But I think as a country, you need to think long and hard about, there's those things that, that are thrust upon you, and there are those things you do to yourself. But we are where we are, and we will just have to sort it. It's just looking at the next 10 days, it will be quite interesting to see what course of action people follow. Yeah. I just don't know.
Indeed. Well, it would be great to hear some of the output from the Foundation in due course. But so I think we are out of time, I'm afraid. There were tons and tons of questions. Sorry I couldn't get nearly all of them. We'd have been here until after all of the votes if we'd have gone through all of them. But if we can thank Alistair for his time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.